Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and so my run through PMQs from yesterday, Prime Minister's questions, with the 6 questions from Keir Starmer plus the 2 from Ian Blackford of the SNP, with 1 from a Lib Dem MP to start the ball rolling, thrown in for good measure, in which neither Starmer nor Blackford got an answer to the question that they asked of Boris Johnson. And not just that the answer they didn't want, but Boris Johnson refused to answer all of them. So you could argue that's 8 questions that Boris Johnson felt suitably uncomfortable answering and so just refused, which is as much of a win as you can expect these days. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So first of all, I have to say it was not the fireworks that I thought it might be. I mean... What do I think about this? I sort of proposed yesterday some questions I think I might have asked and I might have expected Keir Starmer to ask. Didn't ask most of them. With a couple of them, I think Boris Johnson gave the game away on his 6th answer as to why that was probably, on balance, a sensible decision by Starmer. But we'll go through them. But first of all, before Keir Starmer asks his 6, another MP gets to stand up and ask a question. On this particular occasion, it was a Liberal Democrat who was asking about the statement in the House yesterday from the Northern Ireland Secretary that was acknowledging that the government intends to break the law. They're going to introduce a bill with the specific intention of breaking international law. And the Liberal Democrat MP said, well, you know, if ministers are not expected to obey the law, how does the government expect people at home to do so? To which Boris Johnson just stood up and said, word for word, we expect everybody in this country to obey the law, and then sat down. Now, at that point, I sort of thought to myself, I'm not sure Starmer's going to be asking about this. I thought he probably would. I did say yesterday that if he didn't, it's probably because it'd be a break. It's something that Boris Johnson wants him to talk about because it gets him onto his comfortable hill of Brexit. Comfortable for the time being, at any rate. Quite how it should be comfortable quite at the moment, but it is. That's just how it is playing in the public. But what Keir Starmer opened up with was he gave an example of a mother who tried to get a COVID test for her daughter. She was not well. She was displaying symptoms, and she was passed from pillar to post. She was told she was London-based, told initially to go to Romford at 9 o'clock, but there weren't any tests there. Then told to go another location much further away. She didn't go there, of course, just inquired, are there tests? No tests there. By lunchtime, she was being told to go to Telford or Inverness, for those who don't know the geography, miles away. Other end of the country, quite frankly. And so what Starmer was saying, he went on with the rest of the mess for the entire day. At the end of the day, she still didn't manage to get a test booked for her, child, which means that child has to be, off school. And Starmer asked, very simple question, who does the Prime Minister think is responsible for this? Now, here's where Boris Johnson doesn't seem to have paid attention to his English lessons, because he doesn't seem to understand what the word responsible means. Because he said the words, I take responsibility, which in theory you go, well, that's sort of answering the question, isn't it? But the thing about taking responsibility is it's more than just words. You have to then say what you're going to do about it. And what he did about it was he's used this line before. Now, if I'm going to criticize, and I've got a few criticisms of Starmer on this one, because last week was an absolute masterclass of a PMQs. I thought this one, although it wasn't flat, because every single question probed Johnson and Johnson didn't have an answer for it, and that would be obvious to anyone watching it. But there's a couple of things I really thought he should have got in. So Boris Johnson tried going on the attack against Starmer, saying, well, what I would say is that those who attack NHS track and trace, or test and trace, I think he might have actually called it on this occasion. And that's the line he tries to do with Starmer. You're just attacking the NHS. They're trying their best. They're doing their best. And you're constantly attacking them, which is not true. He's not attacking them. He's attacking the government ministers who are not allowing the NHS to do their jobs. I'm going to come to that. But I'll go through Johnson's answer. He says, because of the success of test and trace, the capacity has gone up to 320,000 tests a day, which is very unlikely to be true, by the way. In fact, we know it's not true. Starmer sort of alluded to official government figures later on. But anyway, and he said it was the reason why things are going wrong at the moment is because it's the public's fault. It's people It's their fault for not following the guidance. Now, you have to bear in mind, the guidance a few weeks ago was to go to pubs, restaurants, get yourselves packed out into offices, get yourself on public transport. I mean, that's what's caused this. But anyway, never mind. And he said, this is why changing the social distancing rules in order to keep schools open is so important. So for those who don't know what the government did, they announced a couple of nights ago, the rule of 6. So now you're not allowed a gathering of more than 6 people, basically unless there's some finance going on. Because there's all sorts of exceptions. In fact, the exceptions basically mean the rule is virtually worthless. All it actually rules out is having a video party at your house. Blu-ray party these days, I suppose I should call it. So you're still allowed gatherings of people. Basically, as James Dolman, who's a legal commentator, Scottish legal commentator, pointed out, it's a bit like it in Scotland itself. You know, the rules are you're not allowed a gathering of more than 6 people unless there's a till. So if there's any commerce going on, any money changing hands, then it's allowed. So it's allowed for work, it's allowed for businesses, it's allowed for anything where there's economic activity. So I suppose all you have to do is charge people for coming into your house and it's fine. And he said, you know, and it's important we do this in order to keep schools open, the economy running, virus under control. And he hopes that Starmer can support the NHS test and trace. Now, I'm just going to point out, at no point and if Starmer was going to push this line throughout Prime Minister's questions, and he did, I really would have liked him to have pointed out that it's not NHS test and trace. The NHS are not running it. Private companies are running it. That's the problem. That is the problem. It's private companies dealing with it, not the NHS. The NHS's name is slapped on it, but it's got nothing to do with them. They've got no control over the project at all. But anyway, Starmer stood up then for his second question. He said, look, I'll listen to these measures, because the government's only just announced these measures. No one's gone through them in any detail. I'll listen to the measures later on, but in principle, I will support them, as I have supported all of the measures the government's put in place. The point he's trying to make, of course, is that what his issue is the measures that the government haven't put in place. That's the problem, not the measures they have, the measures they have not. And he said nobody is attacking here. The Prime Minister needs to know how anxious these families are. You know, they're being sent all over the country or told there is no test at all. The government line on testing changes all the time. He says, he quoted the director of Test and Trace yesterday, who apologised, saying that it was a laboratory processing problem. Which, by the way, needs to be pointed out, we have got plenty of laboratory capacity that the government keep ignoring. For months, we've had laboratories up and down the country, university laboratories, research laboratories saying, we can help out, we can help you out. And they keep being turned down. So we do have greater capacity than we are using. But again, they don't want anyone else involved in it because they want to suppress the figures. But anyway, Starmer was pointing out that the director of Test and Trace was saying it's a laboratory processing problem. And he noted that Matt Hancock was actually answering questions in the House the day before, on the Tuesday, and he made no mention of blaming the public, but all of a sudden on Wednesday morning it was the public's fault. And he was going, well, he seems to have changed tack there. What's happened there? And what he said is, to the Prime Minister, he said, who is correct? Is it the director of Test and Trace who says it's a laboratory problem, or is it the Health Secretary who says it's the public's fault? To which Johnson again didn't answer the question. He said he sympathises, but the demand is unprecedented. At which point, again, I mean, just because I say I would have said this, I'm not saying Starmer absolutely should have done, and it's a criticism, but I'd have thought to myself, if we're saying at the moment the demand is unprecedented, I would think to myself, is it really unprecedented? Is it more unprecedented than when we hit the peak of cases? Because we're not there yet. We may be heading for a second peak or wave or spike, whatever you wish to call it, but we're still on the upward, trend there. We have had a peak already. Are we saying that demand now is greater than it was during that first wave or spike? Really? Because I'm not sure that's true. I'd like to see some figures on that, in fact. But he maintained that the demand is higher, and this country has done more tests than any other country in Europe. Again, there was no point in Starmer picking this one, but I will just say for myself, it's very difficult to get accurate data from a number of countries in Europe. It's very difficult to say this. Apart from anything else, the government are still refusing to publish how many people have been tested a day. In fact, it seems clear to me that the government doesn't even have that data. It deliberately is not asking those private companies for those data. And he said the capacity will soon be up to 500,000 tests a day. Note when he says tests a day, because that can be fiddled. People tested a day is what matters. The implication for people who don't realise they're up to fun and games will be, oh, we'll be testing 500,000 people a day. No, we won't. We won't even have the capacity to test that many people a day. Because that's what he's talking about as well. The government distinguished some months ago the difference between capacity and what they're actually doing. The capacity is worthless if you can't get a test. What matters is, can you get a test? And he's noted that Starmer said the previous day that the system was on the verge of collapse, and he said he probably regrets those words now, and I think he should take them back. Keir did not take them back. He noted that hundreds of families who need a test are unable to get one. He said, I acknowledge the numbers overall, that you're quoting. He says, but this is basic stuff. People are anxious. They're told that they should be able to get a test. They can't get a test. It means that they can't go to work. It means that they cannot send their children to school if they can't get tests. He says the Prime Minister needs to take responsibility. And he said specifically, and I'm glad he said this because this is what Johnson always tries to do, he says, not just about the future or something else, but address this problem. Because he knows what Johnson does. He'll promise something for the future or he'll bang on about something else. He says, no, this is the problem. Can you address this, please? And then he said, I want to take it further because it's not just about being sent hundreds of miles away. And he used an example of someone whose wife, in London, with a temperature, tried to get an appointment booked, couldn't. They were told there was no capacity. Then they tried to get a home testing kit and they were told there was none available. And Starmer noted that yesterday there were no tests available in London or the day before. So he asked the Prime Minister, what is happening? To which Johnson then stood up and says, look, I note he won't take back his attack on the NHS, which is why I really thought Starmer should have made the point there's no such thing as the NHS test and trace system. It's not the NHS running it. They've slapped the name on it, but it ain't them running it. In fact, he should be calling for Boris Johnson to give the NHS, control over that project. But anyway, Johnson then said it's not on the verge of collapse, at which point Starmer did a bit of a double take, I have to say. It's like, you what, mate? But there it is. Then he banged on about some mythical future. He said, I'm looking at the future where I have a dream where we can all have tests. Asymptomatic people can have tests. In other words, everyone can get up in the morning and have a test. Everyone. Which is precisely what Starmer asked him not to do. He says, don't bang on about the future. Tell me what you're going to do about this problem now. But that's the problem with Johnson. He can't, because everything he tries, he fails. Everything. All he can do is promise shiny things for the future. He's done it right from the start of this crisis. Oh, next month this is going to happen. In a few weeks this is going to happen. In a couple of months this is going to happen. He can never proudly stand up and say, we've done this. And he never explains what he's doing about the crap in the present. And then what he actually said was, in the meantime, the NHS test and trace are doing heroic work, and most people are getting their results within 24 hours. And the median journey, which is a bullshit average to use for this particular test, says the median journey time is under 10 miles to get a test. But that's a worthless stat. But like Disraeli said, there are lies, damn lies, and statistics. Of course, it's not the statistics that lie. It's people who are not familiar with statistics that will be caught off by things. So then Keir said, look, I've offered to help the government. I've offered to help them on this programme. But if someone is told to drive hundreds of miles, something is wrong. And also, it's got a lot worse in the last week. Because again, he's pointing out the fact the system, it's not like Johnson would try and paint the picture that, they've got this massive demand and it's coping, but it's getting better and better. But it's not, it's getting worse. It's getting objectively worse. Starmer said it's got a lot worse in the last week or two. And everyone in the House will know this because they'll have constituents contact them and telling them of the problems they're having. And then he said, the Prime Minister talks about capacity, but the latest government figures from last night, this is now the night before as you're watching this, where it said there were an average of 75,000 tests not being used every single day. That's tests that the government are counting in their capacity, by the way, but are not being used. And he said, if there are 75,000 tests not being used, why yesterday were people told to go hundreds of miles for a test and other people's been told there just simply is no capacity? There aren't any tests. Why is that? Now, of course, we will know the answer for that. It's because those tests are not in the right place, because there is no effective logistics system to get them into the right place. But, you could sort of tell with that question that Starmer absolutely had him, because although up to now, Boris, you could argue that he still had him because Boris Johnson hasn't been able to answer the question properly. But on this particular case, but he at least had his prepared statement of waffle to go on. He stood up straight away and went, "Oh, he's attacking the NHS. Rah, they're heroes. We should be cheering them on." He actually had him because Boris Johnson stood up and he first of all, the first words come out, "Oh, Mr. Speaker," which is a simple one to start with because you're supposed to address the Speaker. Then he paused for a good few seconds. There's like words trying to come out and his brain's going, "No, don't say that for Christ's sake. What about this? No, God, no." So there was a good long pause. And there isn't usually with him, unless he's really stuck. And then what he did is he said, "Look, there's been just going back onto a previous one. Maybe that's what his brain was doing. Can I really just go back to a previous answer to a different question? Yeah, why not?" And he said, "Look, there's increase in demand for people who need or want tests." Again, a little bit of subtle language there, trying to suggest maybe some people trying to get tests that don't need them, they just want them. Again, I have to say, more than during the peak. And he said, "Look, and we need to prioritise NHS frontline workers and care workers as we massively increase the capacity for these tests. It's those groups who are getting priority." But I have to say, as far as I am aware, they are still not getting the tests they need, even frontline NHS staff. And like I said, I really wish Starmer would pull him up, because if you're going to just ask more than what you asked, 6 questions on this test and trace system, and if you're going to spend the whole PMQs doing it, pull him up on the fact it's not NHS. Anyway, so then he went on to a rant. He went on to his usual rant that had nothing to do with the question, saying, "We're reaching 80% of the people who are leaving details," which you have to point out is still less than 100% though. We're supposed to be contacting 100% of the people we have details for. And he said that, and the reason we're achieving this is because the British public are ignoring the attempts of the honourable member for blah, blah, to undermine test and trace, and they're working together to get this disease defeated. And I'm thinking, working together? This is the same Prime Minister who, in his response to an earlier question, said it's the public's fault we're in this mess. We should make his mind up. Are we working together, or are the public just arseholes, Boris? Which is it? Anyway. So then Keir stood up, said, "Look, I'm listening to what the Prime Minister's saying, but what's undermining confidence is being told to drive hundreds of miles and not being able to get a test." He says, "I don't want an argument, I just want it fixed." He says, "What's the problem?" He said, all the Prime Minister would have to do is just say, "Look, what's the problem? Accept there's a problem. Tell us what the solution is, and we'll all, what your plan is, and we'll all muck in and try and make it better." And he said, trying to help out Boris Johnson, he said, "Is the Prime Minister saying there are too many people coming forward for tests? Is it a capacity problem or not?" He said, "People are trying to do the right thing. They want to go back to work. We want children back in school. The government side of the bargain was to deliver an effective test, trace and isolate scheme. But 2 weeks into September, and there's a glaring hole." So then he asked a question. He thought, right, I'll ask a really simple question. I just want a date, just a date. When did the Prime Minister first know of this problem of people being told to drive hundreds of miles or being told that tests were not going to be available? Nice and simple. Did the Prime Minister answer that? Did he, bollocks? He went on again about the greater demand. And he said, "Look, I've been trying to give the figures." Go on, then we just want a date. And then he gave some, again, the same figures have been so-called trying to give so far, no date at all. And he says, and thanks to those people who are listening to Starmer, they're looking for some encouragement or belief. And there's that old belief again, that Boris Johnson belief. If you just believe, everything will be all right. That's the problem with everything wrong in the world, according to Boris Johnson. You just don't believe. Because, it worked for him. Like, when he was young, he just believed he'd grow up to be rich. Hooray, he did. And then he believed he'd be Prime Minister. Well, lo and behold, he's Prime Minister. He put no effort into it. Can't be anything to do with hard work because he's never done a day's work in his life. So it must have been the belief. And if only everyone would believe like him, then life would be amazing. That's the only conclusion I can draw. But anyway, he went on with the same old stats he'd spouted before, which were an answer to a question that nobody asked. Then he said, look, it's hard work. This is a big job. As if he understands any of those words. He may understand the word it's, I think. And I think that those people working so hard need to hear some praise and encouragement from the leader of the opposition. So then Starmer gets up for his final question. He knows there's no comeback to this. He knows that Boris Johnson's just going to go up and grandstand. So all the sixth question is, you just use it to make a point. So he stood up and he just said, look, why can't we just hear from the Prime Minister an honest answer? If he just stood at the dispatch box and said, we've got a problem. We've been getting hundreds of people being sent all over the place, all being told that they can't get a test at all. I've looked into it. I've worked out what the problem is. Here is my plan. Then people would be reassured. But as ever, he pretends the problem isn't there. The infection rate is rising, the very point at which we needed the world-beating testing regime. But at the point it was promised, the government can't even get the basics right. He said it's lurching from crisis to crisis. Now, unfortunately, at this point, he fluffed his lines and gave Johnson an easy out, which is unfortunate, but there it is. We all do it. He meant to say this government lacks basic competence. Unfortunately, he said this government lacks basic incompetence. He did correct it, didn't miss a beat, did correct it. Unfortunately, the damage was done, I'm afraid. He said this is what's holding Britain back. He said, last question, when is this problem with test, trace and isolate going to be fixed? To which Johnson didn't even answer that, which is, there was a time when he would. There was a time when he'd say, well, and by the end of the thingy, we're going to have this and that will sort it all out. Can't even be asked to do that these days. But unfortunately, like I said, Starmer did give him an easy out. He said, well, I think he was on the money when he said this government lacked incompetence. To which he got a rousing cheer and a laugh from his own side. Of course you would. Of course you would. That's politics. There we go. Don't fluff your lines is the learning point there. And he said, we're working flat out to address all the issues, including trying to get the infection rate down. And then, as I say, he grandstanded on his usual attacks and tried to get it onto Brexit now. I said yesterday, I understood the link with Brexit in attacking the government over this new bill that is going to be breaching their own withdrawal agreement. And obviously, it's like they say in sport, always do the opposite of what your opponent wants you to do. What Boris Johnson wants Starmer to do is to talk about Brexit. There will come a time when he won't. That's not now. It hopefully will be coming soon. But I sort of understood for that. And you could tell from this point, because then Boris Johnson stood up and he talked about this bill that's actually getting him into deep trouble and going to lose him a lot of political capital. But he so confident is he on his Brexit hill, he pointed out that Starmer had said not a word about it. He said he'd let his own MPs talk about it in the House, but he's remained silent on it. A great ox has stood on his tongue. He's used that one before. And at that point, I thought to myself, OK, I'll accept that Starmer was right not to talk about that, because Boris Johnson desperately wants Starmer to do that. And I do not want Starmer, even if I want Starmer and I want Labour to talk about Brexit and I want the debate happening in public again, and I want that with all haste. If Boris Johnson desperately wants Starmer to ask a particular question, that for me is good enough reason not to ask it. Ask the ones that will be awkward for him, which he did. It's just a shame that, I think for someone watching this PMQs, yes, it highlighted that Boris Johnson doesn't have a plan to fix these problems. Because otherwise he would be proud to proclaim the plan. He doesn't know what he's doing. It was completely exposed that Boris Johnson's all at sea. But it wasn't quite the firecracker that it could have been. Anyway, then we had Ian Blackford for the SNP. Now, he did ask about that. He was not shying away from that at all, because from his point of view, it's very much in line with his party politics at all. Fair enough. So he pushed the government on their internal market proposals, and he said that this is nothing short of an attack on Scotland's Parliament, which is true, and an affront to the Scottish people, which I'm quite sure is also true. He says this legislation breaks international law, as we've already heard in the House, but it also breaks domestic law. He says they are creating a rogue state where the rule of law does not apply. Why does the Prime Minister think that he and his friends are above the law? To which Boris Johnson wouldn't answer the question at all and said, well, this internal market bill is all about protecting jobs, protecting growth. Which is an odd thing to say in a recession, don't you think? Because don't you protect something you already have? We don't have growth. So how can you protect it? Shouldn't you have said ensuring growth? But like I've already said today, I don't think Boris Johnson always understands words. We haven't actually had growth since Boris Johnson's been Prime Minister, have we? And after this week's little antics, he crashed the pound again, didn't he? I'll bet plenty of his friends got advance notice of that statement and made a packet. But anyway, he banged on about his aspirations for the bill. But remember, what's been talked about here is the actual bill. What is the bill about? No bill is about protecting jobs. The intention of a bill might be protecting jobs, but there's no such thing as a bill that actually protects jobs. You know, it does a thing. Why won't he talk about what the bill actually does? Because he doesn't want to, because it's very damaging for the country. So Blackford absolutely exposed that one. Then he said, Ian Blackford said, now I liked the way he phrased this question, although he did do his own bit of grandstanding at the end. He reminded the House that we saw the Prime Minister break the law last year during the prorogation of Parliament. We've seen the behaviour of Dominic Cummings. And we know that he's prepared to break international obligations. All of that is absolute fact. And he said his own white paper is clear that state aid is going to be grabbed back from Scotland and handed to Westminster. Then he quoted a number of people. He quoted NFU Scotland, National Farmers Union, who warned that the proposals limit devolved administrations. The Commons Constitutional Affairs Committee, cross-party MPs, who were saying it will create new reservations in areas of devolved competence. And then he quoted the General Teaching Council for Scotland, who warned that it also undermined the devolution of education. He said, Blackford said, this is the reality. Now, why that's so effective is what you're doing, just like Starmer does, you're quoting experts in their field, people who will know about something. So that Johnson can't just dismiss it as politicking. And then Blackford said, the Scottish Parliament will reject this attack on devolution. And he said, will the Prime Minister break domestic law and disregard the settled will of the Scottish people, ignore the concerns of Scotland's communities and press ahead with this bill? And then he went on a bit about independence. So Boris Johnson stood up and said, yes, we will press ahead with this bill. He also said Blackford's attacks were illogical. Which, again, odd thing to say when he actually presented in this particular question attacks from experts in their area of expertise. And multiple experts in their area of expertise. So, again, but I do have to say the Prime Minister's defence of this bill, just to finish with, is, I say just to finish with, there's another thing to finish with. It is likely to be the beginning of yet another U-turn, because I've seen over the last day several Conservative politicians, including MPs, come out against the unlawful aspects of it. I get the impression there's an awful lot of discomfort over this, and I don't think they're going to accept it. I can't see this getting onto the statute books. We've even had a Welsh Conservative MP resign his position, of the Welsh Parliament. Not as a Welsh MP, that has to say, but his position on the Conservative bench. Now, I am going to have to finish off, because people will expect to talk about this. One last piece of parliamentary drama. Ian Blackford called Boris Johnson a liar. No, you can't do that. And the Speaker rebuked him for it, as the Speaker is duty-bound to do. Now, there's a lot of people very upset by this and very upset at the Speaker. People are pointing out we have this ridiculous scenario where Boris Johnson is allowed to tell lies in Parliament, clear lies, without consequence, but another MP is not allowed to call them a liar for doing so. Now, is that ridiculous? Well, it is and it isn't. I mean, here's the thing. Of course, a politician is not supposed to lie in Parliament. Of course they are not. But that is a convention that Boris Johnson is trampling on. But there is no policing of it. However, it is an established rule that no member of the House calls another member of the House a liar. In fact, there's a whole list of words you're not allowed to call them. You are not allowed to call them a liar. And I know in this context, Blackford is telling the truth. Boris Johnson is a liar. But imagine what would happen under normal circumstances, because politicians on each side of the House are always trying to, you know, not only talk up their ideas, but talk down their opponents. You would never get anything done, because every time someone stood up to say something, the other side would call them a liar. It would be all the time. It would be constant. You do get a more reasonable debate when you are forced to focus on the issues and not personalities and character flaws and things like that. I know that it's not working with populists who have no respect for democracy like Boris Johnson, but also calling him a liar doesn't help either. The rule doesn't stem from having stains like Johnson on our nation in Parliament. It is what it is. You can't. No point in blaming the Speaker. I'm disinclined to criticise Blackford for doing it, because, you know, he could be genuinely pissed off with Johnson. I am. But at the same time, nothing the Speaker could do about it. It would be an actual genuine scandal if the Speaker had not rebuked Blackford for that. That would actually be unacceptable behaviour. And people go, oh, we should get John Bercow back. John Bercow would have pulled him up on it as well. Because that is a rule of the House. It's not just a convention, it's a rule of the House. But anyway, there we go. Another week of drama. Not quite so dramatic as last week. I hope it picks up a bit next week. But there it is. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. If you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.